Hey kid, come here. Harrison Sterling's voice cut through the air of the luxury hall like a blade, loaded with that refined cruelty that only millionaires can perfect. The 42-year-old man, dressed in a suit that cost more than a complete family's annual salary, pointed with his champagne glass at the 11-year-old boy who was walking alongside his mother, selling raffle tickets to survive. Yes, you, the one with the worn-out shoes. Harrison walked toward the red Ferrari that dominated the center of the hall, placed his hand on the hood like a predator marking territory, and shouted with a smile that froze blood, "I'll give you my Ferrari if you start it. $400,000 if you can make this engine roar." The explosion was instantaneous. Cruel laughter erupted throughout the hall. Phones rose to film what promised to be the humiliation of the year. The guests approached like vultures, their voices mixing in a choir of merciless mockery. "This has to be recorded. The raffle kid against the Ferrari. Poor boy, he's going to make a fool of himself." But Leo Davidson didn't back down. His dark eyes rose toward Harrison without blinking, and when he spoke, his voice cut through the noise of laughter like a sword slicing through silk. "I accept." The silence that followed was so abrupt you could hear the electric hum of the lights. The phones kept filming, but now they were capturing something different. The exact moment when an 11-year-old boy had just challenged an entire world of privilege and arrogance. No one imagined who that boy really was. No one knew the secret that was about to roar through 6 cylinders of Italian steel. If this story already touched your heart in this first minute, subscribe to the channel. Here you'll find stories that heal, inspire, and make you believe in human goodness again. 2 hours earlier, the luxury automobile charity gala sparkled like a diamond in the heart of Los Angeles. The glass walls of the hall reflected the gleam of jewelry that cost more than a house, while guests strolled among the world's most expensive cars, like elegant predators in their territory. The air smelled of $1,000-per-ounce French perfumes, freshly polished Italian leather, and the metallic aroma of limitless money. Women's heels clicked on the marble like expensive raindrops, while men in custom-made suits spoke in low voices about million-dollar mergers and vacations on private islands. In the center of the hall, like the king of his kingdom of steel and vanity, stood Harrison Sterling. At 42, Harrison had built a real estate empire that stretched across 3 continents. His black hair was slicked back with gel that cost more than his employees' monthly salary, and his gray eyes had that special coldness that only develops in men who have stepped on thousands of people on their way to the top. Tonight, Harrison wore a black Tom Ford suit that fit his body like a second skin, and on his wrist gleamed a Patek Philippe he had bought only because he knew there was a 5-year waiting list to get one. He didn't need it. He just wanted to be able to say he had it. "This beauty," Harrison said, caressing the blood-red hood of his Ferrari 488 GTB, with movements that seemed almost intimate, "arrived directly from Maranello just a week ago. $400,000 of pure Italian engineering." The guests approached like moths to light, their eyes shining with that mixture of desire and envy that Harrison knew so well. He loved that look. It confirmed that he had won. "Of course," he continued, his voice loaded with that soft arrogance he had perfected over years. "Not just anyone can handle a machine like this. It requires class, refinement, blue blood." General laughter swept through the group. Harrison smiled, showing teeth so white and perfect they seemed made of porcelain. It was then that he saw her. At the entrance of the hall, almost hidden behind a marble column, a woman of about 35, dressed in the black and white uniform of the catering service, was trying to go unnoticed. Her brown hair was pulled back in a perfect ponytail, and in her hands she carried a tray of crystal glasses that trembled slightly. But it wasn't her who had caught Harrison's attention. It was the boy walking beside her. Leo Davidson was 11 years old, but his gaze seemed much older. He was thin like a young willow, with black hair tousled by the street wind, and clothes clean but worn by someone who knows the value of every penny. His sneakers had seen better days, and in his right hand he carried a small cardboard box with stickers and numbers for a raffle. The mother and son moved with that special caution of those who know they don't belong in a place, but need to be there to survive. Harrison felt his lips curve into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He had found his entertainment for the night. "Excuse me," he said, his voice cutting through conversations like a blade. "It seems we have unexpected visitors." All eyes turned towards Sarah Davidson and her son. The woman froze like a deer in headlights, her knuckles white on the crystal tray. "Sir," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper, "we're just working. My boss gave us permission to—" "Easy, easy." Harrison raised a hand with a magnanimous gesture, like an emperor granting audience. "No problem. In fact—" His eyes settled on Leo with an intensity that made the air seem denser. "I find it interesting that you bring children to an event like this." Leo didn't lower his gaze. There was something in his dark eyes that challenged Harrison in a way the millionaire didn't expect. It wasn't insolence, it wasn't fear. It was something much more dangerous. It was knowledge. "What's your name, boy?" asked Harrison, approaching with measured steps. "Leo Davidson," the boy replied, his voice clear and firm. "Leo Davidson," repeated Harrison, savoring each syllable like expensive wine. "And what are you doing here, Leo Davidson?" The boy lifted his raffle box with a simple but dignified gesture. "I help my mom and sell raffle tickets to raise money." The laughter that burst from the group of guests was like the sound of breaking crystal. Harrison felt a wave of power running through his veins. This was what he liked most, the moment just before humiliation. "Raffles?" he asked, feigning genuine interest. "And what kind of prizes do you have there?" Leo opened the box, showing small racing car stickers, plastic keychains, and some candy wrapped in shiny paper. "Formula One car keychains," said Leo, his voice staying steady. "And candy." Harrison burst into laughter that sounded like a luxury car engine, powerful, polished, and completely soulless. "Formula One cars!" he exclaimed, turning toward his guests. "Did you hear that? This boy sells plastic keychains of race cars." More laughter. Sarah Davidson looked like she wanted to disappear into the marble floor, but Leo remained motionless, his eyes fixed on Harrison with that gaze that was beginning to disturb the millionaire more than he was willing to admit. "Tell me, Leo," Harrison approached until he stood in front of the boy, his height casting a shadow that seemed to swallow the light. "Have you ever seen a real car? Not plastic, not on television? A real car?" "Yes," Leo replied without hesitation. "Really?" Harrison arched an eyebrow, his smile becoming crueler. "And where was that?" Leo didn't respond immediately. His eyes moved slowly from Harrison toward the red Ferrari that dominated the center of the hall, and something changed in his expression. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Harrison noticed it. It was as if the boy was seeing something that no one else could see. "In many places," Leo finally said, his voice strangely distant. "In many places," repeated Harrison, and this time his laughter was like breaking ice. "Fantastic! So you're quite the car expert." He turned toward his guests with arms extended like an actor on stage. "Ladies and gentlemen, it seems we have a connoisseur among us. Leo Davidson, the boy who has seen real cars in many places." The group laughed with that uncomfortable laughter that arises when people know they are witnessing something cruel but don't have the courage to stop it. Harrison walked to his Ferrari, his Italian shoes echoing on the marble like hammer blows. He placed his hand on the car's hood with the possessive gesture of someone touching something that defines their identity. "You know what, Leo Davidson?" he said, his voice loaded with malicious amusement. Since you're such a car expert, I'm going to make you a proposition. The hall fell silent. Even the tinkling of crystal glasses stopped. If you manage to start my Ferrari... Harrison made a dramatic pause, savoring the moment. It's yours. The statement fell on the hall like a silent bomb. The guests exchanged looks of genuine shock. Had they heard correctly? Had Harrison Sterling just bet his $400,000 Ferrari? Sarah Davidson approached her son with trembling steps. "Leo, let's go," she whispered, her voice loaded with panic. "Please, let's go." But Leo didn't move. His eyes remained fixed on Harrison, and there was something in his gaze that made the millionaire feel a strange chill running down his spine. "Of course," continued Harrison, recovering his composure and smiling with the cruelty of someone about to crush an ant, "if you fail to start it, you and your mother leave here immediately and never come back." "Harrison!" A woman's voice cut through the tense air of the hall. Everyone turned to see Victoria Roberts, the chief engineer of the local racing team. At 32, Victoria was one of the few women who had managed to make her way in the male world of automotive engineering. Her black hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her green eyes shone with an intelligence that had designed engines capable of winning international races. "This is ridiculous," Victoria said, approaching with determined steps. "He's just a child." "Exactly," replied Harrison, his smile becoming even wider. "Just a child who says he knows about cars. What's the problem? If he really knows them, he shouldn't have difficulties." Victoria looked at Leo, and for a moment their eyes met. There was something in the boy's gaze that stopped her. It wasn't fear, it wasn't confusion. It was familiarity, as if he had seen thousands of cars before. "Leo," said Harrison, his voice now loaded with theatrical impatience, "do you accept my proposition?" The boy looked at his mother, who was shaking her head with tears in her eyes. Then he looked at the Ferrari, and his eyes stopped on details that no one else had noticed. The exact position of the mirrors, the angle of the steering wheel, the way light reflected on the dashboard. Finally, Leo raised his gaze toward Harrison. When he spoke, his voice had a calm that chilled the blood of everyone present. "I accept." The silence that followed was so profound you could hear heartbeats. Harrison felt a strange pang of uneasiness, but he crushed it immediately. It was impossible. An 11-year-old boy couldn't start a Ferrari. It was technically impossible, and more importantly, symbolically perfect for his humiliation. "Excellent," said Harrison, rubbing his hands with satisfaction. "So, Leo Davidson, go ahead. Show us how to start a Ferrari." Leo walked toward the car with steps that didn't hesitate once. His mother followed him with her gaze, and Victoria observed every movement with an attention that bordered on scientific. The boy stopped in front of the driver's door, and for a moment he simply looked at the car, not with the drooling admiration of a child seeing an expensive toy, but with the evaluative gaze of someone who understands exactly what they're seeing. Then, Leo did something no one expected. He smiled. It wasn't a smile of nervousness or childish excitement. It was the smile of someone who had just recognized an old friend. And that's when Victoria Roberts realized that something very extraordinary was about to happen. What did that boy know that no one else knew? Why did he look at the Ferrari as if it were something more than an expensive car? Leo opened the Ferrari door with a movement so natural it seemed he had been doing it his whole life. The sound of Italian metal opening resonated in the hall like a perfect musical note. The guests approached, forming a semicircle, their faces mixing morbid curiosity with the expectation of witnessing an epic humiliation. Harrison positioned himself in the front row, with arms crossed and that cruel smile he had perfected during years of stepping on others to climb higher. "Go ahead, champ," he said sarcastically. "Let's see those expert skills." Leo slid into the driver's seat, and immediately something changed in the hall's atmosphere. The boy didn't look lost or intimidated as everyone expected. His small hands moved over the car's interior with a familiarity that made Victoria Roberts frown and move closer. The Ferrari's interior was a sanctuary of black Frau leather, polished carbon fiber, and brushed aluminum. The dashboard gleamed with the most advanced technology money could buy. Digital screens showing every engine parameter, touch controls that responded to the slightest touch, and a steering wheel that had been designed for hands that knew the difference between life and death at 300 kilometers per hour. But Leo didn't look at the digital screens. Instead, he adjusted the seat with 3 precise movements, as if he knew exactly the position he needed. Then he adjusted the rearview mirrors with a precision that made Sarah Davidson cover her mouth with her hands, recognizing something in her son's movements that filled her with a mixture of pride and terror. "Are you comfortable there, Leo?" asked Harrison, his voice dripping condescension. "Do you need a pillow, maybe a stool to reach the pedals?" The group's laughter sounded like breaking glass, but Leo didn't respond. His hands moved over the dashboard, not touching the controls, but simply familiarizing himself with them. Victoria leaned forward, and what she saw left her breathless. The boy's fingers moved over the controls as if he were reading Braille. He touched each button, each surface, each texture with a delicacy that spoke of deep knowledge, not childish curiosity. "That boy isn't improvising," Victoria murmured to herself, but her voice was loud enough for some guests to hear. Harrison turned toward her with irritation. "What did you say?" "I said that boy isn't improvising," repeated Victoria, without taking her eyes off Leo. "Look at his movements. He knows exactly what he's doing." "It's impossible," responded Harrison. But for the first time since he began his cruel game, there was a note of uncertainty in his voice. "He's just a kid selling raffles with his mom." Inside the Ferrari, Leo had placed his hands on the steering wheel. The leather felt smooth and warm under his palms, and for a moment he closed his eyes as if he were listening to something only he could hear. He could hear his father's voice, as clear as if he were sitting in the passenger seat. "The engine is like the human heart, Leo. First, you have to listen to it, understand its rhythm. Only then can you give it what it needs to awaken." Leo opened his eyes and looked at the dashboard. Not the digital screens that gleamed with unnecessary information, but the real controls, the ones that mattered. He found what he was looking for immediately. His right foot sought the accelerator pedal, not to press it, but to feel its resistance. His left foot found the clutch, and his right hand settled on the gear shifter with a naturalness that made several invited mechanics exchange surprised looks. "Very well," said Harrison, his impatience growing. "You've played enough. Time for truth." Leo nodded without looking at him. His eyes were fixed on the ignition button, but he didn't move to press it immediately. Instead, he did something no adult in the hall had expected. He adjusted 3 dashboard configurations with quick and precise movements. Victoria was left speechless. "What did he just do?" asked one of the guests. "He configured the ignition mode," responded Victoria, her voice loaded with amazement. "He adjusted the throttle response and clutch sensitivity before even attempting to start the engine." "And what does that mean?" asked Harrison, trying to maintain his mocking tone, but failing slightly. "It means he knows exactly what type of engine he's handling," responded Victoria, moving closer to the car. "And that's impossible unless—" She stopped, an impossible idea beginning to form in her mind. Leo pressed the ignition button. The Ferrari coughed once, like a giant awakening from a long nap. The cylinders turned, the pistons moved, but the engine didn't start. The explosion of laughter and sarcastic applause was immediate. "There you have your expert!" shouted Harrison, his relief transforming into cruel euphoria. "The great Leo Davidson and his car knowledge." "I knew it was pure luck," added another voice. "Come on, champ, try again," shouted someone else, and the laughter multiplied like waves in a pond. But Leo didn't seem bothered. Instead, he tilted his head slightly to one side, as if he were listening to something. Victoria observed with scientific fascination how the boy analyzed the sound the engine had made when it failed. His expression was one of pure concentration, without a trace of panic or embarrassment. "The problem isn't fuel," Leo murmured to himself. But Victoria had trained ears to catch technical details, and she heard him clearly. "What did you say?" she asked, moving closer. Leo looked at her for the first time, and Victoria saw something in his eyes that made her hold her breath. It was knowledge, deep, technical, specific knowledge. "The problem isn't fuel," repeated Leo, his voice clear and sure. "It's the crankshaft position sensor. It's misaligned by 3 degrees. The silence that followed was so profound you could hear a coin dropping. Victoria felt her skin crawl. What that boy had just said was technically precise, specific, and completely impossible to know without years of experience with high-performance engines. That's correct," she whispered almost to herself. "What's correct?" asked Harrison, but now his voice had an edge of nervousness he was desperately trying to hide. "The crankshaft position sensor," responded Victoria, her voice rising in volume. "That Ferrari arrived a week ago from Italy, and the technician who checked it mentioned exactly that problem. A minor misalignment in the sensor that causes occasional ignition failures." The laughter gradually faded, like candles being extinguished one by one. Leo smiled slightly and leaned under the dashboard. His small hands disappeared from view for a moment, and a very soft metallic click was heard. When he straightened up, there was a confidence in his posture that hadn't been there before. "Now, yes," he said simply. He pressed the ignition button for the second time. The roar that burst from the Ferrari was like the war cry of a dragon awakening after 1,000 years of sleep. The engine started with a power that made the crystal glasses on the tables vibrate, that moved the hall's air like a contained hurricane, that filled the space with the most beautiful and terrifying sound money could produce. 660 horsepower roared to life under the hands of an 11-year-old boy. The silence that followed was so complete, it seemed time had stopped. Harrison Sterling, the millionaire who had humiliated hundreds of people, the man who had built an empire on arrogance and contempt, was left completely mute. His smile had vanished like smoke in the wind. Who was that boy, really? How was it possible he knew something that not even specialized technicians had been able to diagnose correctly? The Ferrari's roar gradually faded, but its echo seemed to have been engraved on the hall's walls, like a sound ghost that refused to leave. Leo kept the engine running for a few more seconds, adjusting the accelerator with touches so soft that the V8 responded like a musical instrument tuned by a master. Then, with a movement as natural as breathing, he turned off the engine. The silence that followed was different from the previous one. It wasn't expectation or cruel amusement. It was pure shock, crystallized. Harrison Sterling remained motionless next to the car. His face had lost all trace of arrogance. His grey eyes, which minutes before had shone with malice, now reflected something much more dangerous: confusion and the beginning of fear. Leo opened the Ferrari door and got out with the same naturalness with which he had entered. There was no triumph in his posture, no victorious smile that any child would have shown after such a feat. There was something much deeper, the silent satisfaction of someone who had just demonstrated a truth that others had tried to bury. Victoria Roberts was the first to break the spell. "Impossible," she murmured, approaching the boy. "How did you know about the crankshaft sensor?" Leo looked at her with those eyes that seemed too old for his 11-year-old face. "My dad taught me that engines talk," he said simply. "You just have to know how to listen." "Your dad," repeated Victoria, and something in her tone made everyone present pay attention. "Does your dad work with cars?" Leo exchanged a glance with his mother, who had remained silent during the entire test. Sarah had tears in her eyes, but they weren't tears of shame or fear. They were tears of pride mixed with a pain so deep it seemed to have roots in the soul. "My dad worked with cars," Leo corrected, his voice staying firm despite the emotional weight of the words. "He's not with us anymore." Harrison recovered part of his composure, clinging to his skepticism like a drowning man clings to a life preserver. "Very touching," he said, but his sarcasm sounded forced, mechanical. "But being lucky with a minor repair doesn't mean you really understand what you're talking about." Leo didn't respond immediately. Instead, he walked around the Ferrari with measured steps, his eyes scanning every line, every curve, every detail of the car, with an attention that made Victoria follow him like a scientist observing an inexplicable phenomenon. "This is a 488 GTB, said Leo, his voice taking on a technical tone that contrasted strangely with his age. 2019 model, by the taillights and the front air intake design. He stopped next to the hood and placed his small hand on the red surface. "It carries the F154 CB engine, which is an evolution of the engine the 458 had. But this one has twin turbochargers and a direct injection system that improves response at low speeds." The words came from his mouth with technical precision that made several engineers present exchanged looks of amazement. Victoria felt goosebumps. "How do you know that?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Leo looked at her, and for a moment he seemed much older than he was. "Because my dad helped design the fuel systems for the F-154 engine family." The statement fell on the hall like a nuclear bomb. Harrison laughed, but it was a nervous, sharp laugh. "Please!" he exclaimed. "Now it turns out your dad designed Ferrari engines. What's next? That you're related to Enzo Ferrari?" But Victoria wasn't laughing. As an engineer specialized in racing engines, she knew the history of every important innovation in the automotive industry over the past 20 years. "And what that boy had just said. What was your father's full name?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Leo reached into the pocket of his worn jeans and pulled out something small and shiny. It was a metal keychain, simple but well cared for. On it, engraved with a precision that spoke of years of careful use, was the number 27, and below in smaller letters, a signature, Gabriel Davidson. The keychain fell from Victoria's trembling hands. "My God," she whispered, and her voice carried a tone of reverence that made everyone in the hall move closer. "Gabriel Davidson." "Who is Gabriel Davidson?" asked Harrison, but his arrogance was disintegrating like sugar in rain. Victoria turned toward him with an expression that mixed incredulity and something like indignation. "Gabriel Davidson," she said, her voice rising in volume with each word, "was one of the most brilliant engine engineers in Formula One. He worked for 3 different teams during 15 years. His innovations in fuel systems and aerodynamics revolutionized racing in the early 2000s. The hall had fallen into such profound silence you could hear the electric hum of the ceiling lights. "He died 4 years ago in a car accident," continued Victoria, her voice loaded with respect. "And the number 27, that was his number when he raced as a driver before becoming an engineer." Leo picked up the keychain from the floor with careful movements, as if it were the world's most precious relic. When he raised his gaze, there were tears in his eyes, but his voice didn't tremble. "My dad didn't just design engines," he said. "He taught me that every car has a soul, that every engine has personality, and that if you listen to them carefully, they'll tell you exactly what they need." He walked back toward the Ferrari, but this time he didn't head to the driver's door. He stopped next to the hood and placed both hands on the red surface. "This engine carries modifications based on my dad's work," he said, his voice taking on a strength that filled the entire hall. "The direct injection system, the turbocharger configuration, the way fuel mixes with air. My dad helped create the foundations of all that." He looked directly at Harrison, and for the first time since all this began, the millionaire took a step back. "When I heard the engine fail, I recognized the problem because my dad taught me to identify every sound, every vibration, every breath of these engines. It's not luck, it's knowledge." Harrison tried to recover his arrogance, but his voice sounded hollow, desperate. "That doesn't make you the owner of anything," he said, pointing at the Ferrari with a gesture that seemed more defensive than dominant. "You're still just a kid selling raffles." Leo smiled, but it wasn't a child's smile. It was the smile of someone who had just won a battle he didn't even know he was fighting. "I don't want to own anything," he said, his voice clear as crystal. "I just want you to remember where this comes from." He pointed at the Ferrari, then at the hall full of luxury cars, then at all the people who had come to admire machines they didn't really understand. "I want you to remember that each of these cars exists because men like my dad spent years of their lives thinking, designing, dreaming of ways to make metal and fuel become speed and beauty." His voice grew stronger, and Sarah looked at him with a mixture of pride and amazement that illuminated her face like the sun. "My dad never had a Ferrari," continued Leo. "He never had money to buy the cars he helped create. But every time one of these engines roared on a track, every time a driver won a race, every time someone felt the excitement of perfect speed, there was my dad." The transformation in the hall was palpable. The expressions of mockery had disappeared, replaced by something much more complex: respect, understanding, and in some cases, shame. Victoria approached Leo, and when she spoke, her voice was loaded with an emotion she struggled to contain. "Your father was my hero when I was studying engineering," she said. "I read all his papers, studied all his innovations. When he died, the entire racing engineering community mourned him." She knelt to be at Leo's height, and her eyes shone with unshed tears. "Do you know there's an engineering scholarship that bears his name? Do you know his designs are still the foundation of most modern racing engines?" Leo shook his head, and for the first time since everything began, he looked like what he really was: an 11-year-old boy who desperately missed his father. "After he died, no one looked for us," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "It was as if my dad had never existed." Harrison, who had been listening to everything in silence, felt something strange and unknown running through his veins. It was something he hadn't experienced in years: real shame. He looked at Leo, then at Sarah, then at the Ferrari he had used as an instrument of humiliation, and for the first time in a long time, he realized how small he had become. The group of guests now looked at him with a mixture of expectation and silent judgment. Some had begun to applaud softly, an applause that grew like a wave rising from the ocean floor. Harrison cleared his throat, but when he spoke, his voice had lost all the arrogance from before. "Leo," he said, and the name sounded strange in his mouth, devoid of sarcasm. I didn't know." "It wasn't your job to know," interrupted Leo, and his generosity was like a slap to Harrison. "But now you do know." The applause grew louder, and more people joined in. It wasn't the kind of polite applause heard at social events. It was something deeper, more genuine. It was the sound of justice, finding its way through shame and privilege, like water filtering through cracks in a dam. What would Harrison do now that his world of arrogance had crumbled in front of a child's dignity? Could the echo of a Ferrari's roar forever change the lives of everyone present? The applause gradually faded, but the tension in the hall had completely transformed. It was no longer the cruel expectation of seeing a child humiliated, but something much deeper, the collective recognition that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Leo walked slowly to where his mother stood, and Sarah wrapped him in her arms with a tenderness that made several of those present look away, feeling they were witnessing something too intimate and powerful. "Tell them about the pit, sweetheart. Sarah whispered in her son's ear, her voice loaded with a love that had survived the most devastating loss. "Tell them what it was really like." Leo gently separated from his mother and looked at the group of faces observing him with an attention he had never experienced. For the first time in 4 years, someone wanted to hear the real story. "My dad took me to the pit since I was 3 years old," he began, his voice taking on the distant tone of someone reliving precious memories. "At first, I just sat in a corner and watched him work. But he always explained everything to me. He walked to the center of the hall as if the space had become the stage for the most important story of his life. He taught me that an engine isn't just a machine. It's like a giant heart made of metal. And every part has to work in perfect harmony with the others, like an orchestra." Victoria moved closer, hanging on every word. "Did you work with him on the designs?" Leo nodded, and a small but genuine smile lit up his face. "He said I had engine ear, that I could hear things others couldn't hear. When I was 8 years old, I could already diagnose problems just by sound." He stopped in front of the Ferrari, but this time he didn't touch it. He simply looked at it with that strange familiarity that had puzzled everyone from the beginning. "We lived in a small apartment above the workshop," he continued. "Every night, after dinner, my dad would take me downstairs and we'd work together. He on the big designs, me with the small engines he got from the junkyard." Sarah approached, and when she spoke, her voice was loaded with a sadness she had learned to carry with dignity. "Gabriel always said Leo had the gift," she said. "That in his hands, any engine would sing like an angel." "What happened after the accident?" Victoria asked gently. The question fell on the hall like a cold shadow. Leo lowered his gaze for a moment, and when he raised it, there was a hardness in his eyes that spoke of losses too great for his age. "The teams my dad worked for said they were very sorry," he said, his voice staying firm despite the emotional burden. "They sent flowers to the funeral. They said he was a great engineer and that they would miss him." He paused, and the silence filled with tense expectation. "But when we needed help, when my mom tried to contact them to ask about my dad's life insurance or about some kind of pension, no one answered the calls." Harrison felt something twisting in his stomach. It was a sensation he hadn't experienced in years, real guilt. "We discovered that my dad had signed all his designs as team collaborations," continued Leo. "Technically, legally, he didn't own anything he had created. The injustice of the situation settled over those present like toxic fog. Several of the guests exchanged uncomfortable looks, recognizing the type of corporate practice they had seen or even implemented in their own companies. "We lost the apartment above the workshop," said Sarah, her voice barely a whisper. "We lost all of Gabriel's tools. We lost the prototypes he had been working on." Leo walked back toward the Ferrari, and this time he did put his hand on the hood. "But what they couldn't take from us was what he taught me," he said, his voice growing in strength. "The knowledge he gave me, the way he taught me to listen to engines, to understand their needs, to make them sing." He looked directly at Harrison, and his eyes had an intensity that made the millionaire feel like he was being judged by something much bigger than himself. "This Ferrari," said Leo, patting the hood softly, "carries an engine that uses principles my dad developed. The way fuel is injected, the sensor configuration, even the way air flows through the cylinders, all of that bears the mark of Gabriel Davidson." Victoria moved closer, her engineering mind connecting dots at breakneck speed. "The Delta Project," she murmured. "My God, your father was the leader of the Delta Project." Leo nodded, and for the first time all night, a genuine smile of pride lit up his face. "It was his secret project," he said. "He worked on it for 5 years, designing the perfect fuel system for high-performance engines." Harrison cleared his throat, feeling lost in the technical conversation but unable to step away. "What is the Delta Project?" he asked, hating himself for his ignorance. Victoria turned toward him with an expression that mixed incredulity and professional education. "The Delta Project was the most important innovation in racing engines of the last decade," she explained. "A system that improved fuel efficiency by 30% while increasing power by 15%. All luxury car brands use it now," added Leo. "Ferrari, Lamborghini, McLaren, all of them. But the credits were given to the companies, not to the individual who designed it," finished Victoria, her voice loaded with indignation. "It's a common practice in the industry, but that doesn't make it right." Harrison looked at the Ferrari with new eyes. It was no longer just a symbol of his wealth and power. It was a monument to injustice, a reminder that his luxury had been built on the unrecognized work of men like Gabriel Davidson. The weight of that realization settled on him like an avalanche. "Leo," he said, his voice sounding strange even to himself. "The Ferrari, the deal, you won." Leo looked at him with those eyes too old for his age. "I don't want the Ferrari," he said simply. The statement was like lightning striking the hall. Everyone froze, processing words that seemed impossible. "What?" Harrison blinked, confused. "But you won. It's yours." Leo slowly shook his head. "My dad didn't create engines to be trophies of arrogance," he said, his words cutting through the air like sharp blades. "He created them to be art in motion, to be freedom on wheels." He walked around the Ferrari once more, but this time his movements had a different purpose. This car should be on a track, not in a hall being used to humiliate people. It should be doing what it was designed to do: racing. He looked at Harrison with a mixture of challenge and compassion that the millionaire didn't know how to process. "Keep your Ferrari," said Leo. "But please, next time you start it, remember that the heart that makes it work was designed by a man who loved cars more than money." The silence that followed was different from all the previous ones. It wasn't shock, it wasn't expectation. It was respect. Pure and simple respect toward a child who had just demonstrated more dignity than all the adults in the hall combined. Harrison stood looking at Leo as if he were seeing a ghost. Not the ghost of Gabriel Davidson, but the ghost of the person he himself had been once, before money and power corrupted everything they touched. Could a millionaire learn humility from an 11-year-old boy? Was it possible that the roar of an engine could change the heart of a man who had forgotten how to beat? The transformation in Harrison Sterling wasn't immediate or dramatic. It was like watching ice melting under spring sun, slow, inevitable, and completely irreversible. He approached the Ferrari with uncertain steps, as if the car had changed nature and was now something sacred he didn't dare touch. His hands, which minutes before had caressed the hood with arrogant possession, now trembled slightly as they approached the red surface. "Leo," he said, his voice barely a whisper, would you teach me to start it correctly?" The question fell on the hall, like a confession. The most arrogant millionaire in the city had just asked an 11-year-old boy to teach him something. Leo looked at Harrison for a long moment, evaluating not his words, but his intentions. In those dark eyes that had seen too much for their age, there was wisdom that came from understanding pain and choosing kindness despite it. "Do you really want to learn?" asked Leo. "Or do you just want people to think you've learned?" The question was like an arrow straight to the heart. Harrison stood motionless, confronting an honesty he hadn't experienced in decades. "I want to learn," he said finally, and for the first time in years, he was telling the complete truth. "I want to understand what you just showed me." Leo nodded slowly and walked toward the driver's door. "Then come, but not as the owner of the car. Come as someone who wants to meet a friend." Harrison approached with measured steps, conscious that the entire hall was watching them. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't care what they thought of him. Only what that extraordinary boy was willing to teach him mattered. "First," said Leo, opening the driver's door, "you have to understand that every engine is different. Like people, this Ferrari isn't the same as your neighbors, even if they're the same model." Harrison sat in the driver's seat, but his movements were careful, reverent. "How can I tell the difference?" he asked. "Listen," responded Leo simply. "When you press the ignition button the first time, don't get frustrated if it doesn't work. Listen to what the engine is telling you." Harrison pressed the button. The engine coughed, just like it had when Leo tried it the first time. "What do you hear?" asked Leo. Harrison concentrated, frowning as if he were trying to decipher a foreign language. I hear like it wants to start, but something is stopping it." "Exactly," said Leo, and there was genuine pride in his voice. "Now listen deeper. Does the sound come from the front of the engine or the center?" Harrison closed his eyes, concentrating like he never had before on something that wasn't money or power. "From the center," he said, surprising himself. "Definitely from the center." "Perfect! That means the problem isn't the battery or fuel, it's something in the ignition system." "Can you reach the panel under the steering wheel?" Harrison leaned down, following Leo's instructions with the attention of a diligent student. When his fingers found the correct adjustment and he heard the small metallic click, he felt a satisfaction that had nothing to do with making money or dominating others. "Now try again," said Leo, "but this time press the button with confidence. The engine already knows you're listening." Harrison pressed the button for the second time. The roar that burst from the Ferrari was identical to the previous one, but to Harrison it sounded completely different. It was no longer just noise of power and money. It was music. It was art. It was Gabriel Davidson's voice speaking through time and metal. The tears that rolled down Harrison Sterling's cheeks were the first genuine tears he had shed in 20 years. "My God," he whispered, his voice broken by emotion. It's beautiful." Leo smiled, and in that smile there was forgiveness, understanding, and something like hope. "My dad always said engines didn't roar to impress people," he said. "They roared because they were alive, because they had something to say." Harrison kept the engine running, listening to every nuance of the sound, like it was a symphony. For the first time in his life, he understood the difference between owning something and really knowing it. Victoria approached the car, her eyes shining with an emotion she struggled to contain. "Leo," she said, "I need to ask you something important." Leo looked at her attentively. "Would you like to come work with me?" asked Victoria. "My team is developing engines for race cars. We need someone with your special talent." "Work?" asked Leo, confused. "But I'm only 11 years old." "Work as an apprentice," Victoria clarified quickly. "After school on weekends. You'd learn formal engineering, but you'd also help us with that incredible ability you have to listen to engines." Sarah approached, her eyes shining with a hope she hadn't felt since her husband's death. Would it be paid?" she asked timidly. "Of course," responded Victoria. "And more importantly, it would be preserving and expanding your father's legacy." Leo looked at his mother, then at Victoria, then at the hall full of people who now saw him with genuine respect instead of pity or condescension. "Could I keep helping my mom with the catering work on weekends when I don't have to be at the workshop?" he asked. "Of course," responded Victoria, smiling. "A good engineer always honors his family." Leo extended his small hand toward Victoria, and when she shook it, there was something ceremonial in the gesture. "I accept," said Leo. "But with one condition." "What?" Leo looked directly at Harrison, who was still sitting in the Ferrari with tears drying on his cheeks. "I want Mr. Harrison to be part of the project." The silence that followed was complete shock. Harrison looked up, confused. "Me? But I don't know anything about engines." "You can learn," said Leo simply, "and you have something we need." "What?" resources, connections, the ability to make things happen. Leo paused, and when he continued, his voice had a wisdom that left everyone breathless. My dad was brilliant, but he didn't have the power to make his work properly recognized. You have that power. You could use it for something good. Harrison remained motionless, processing an offer of redemption he had never expected and certainly didn't feel worthy of receiving. "Why?" he asked. "After how I treated you?" "Because everyone deserves a second chance," responded Leo. "And because my dad taught me that revenge is just hatred dressed as justice. I prefer to build something new rather than destroy something old." Harrison turned off the Ferrari's engine, but the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of possibilities, of futures that had seemed impossible before, of second chances and third possibilities. He got out of the car and walked to where Leo and his mother stood. When he reached them, he did something no one in the hall expected. He knelt down, putting himself at the child's height. "Leo Davidson," he said, his voice loaded with a humility that was completely new to him. "It would be an honor to work with you and learn from you." He extended his hand toward Leo, but the boy didn't take it immediately. "One more thing," said Leo. "I need you to understand that this isn't about charity. It's about justice. My dad deserves to be remembered for what he really did, and his work deserves to keep living." "I understand," said Harrison, and for the first time in decades, he really understood something important. Leo took his hand, and in that handshake was the beginning of something neither of them could fully imagine yet. The applause that burst from the hall was different from all the previous ones. It was the sound of hope finding its way through cynicism, of dignity triumphing over arrogance, of a child teaching adults what it really meant to be human. Leo walked once more toward the Ferrari, but this time not to start it or demonstrate it. He approached the car as if he were going to say goodbye to an old friend. He placed his small hands on the hood one last time and closed his eyes. "Thank you, Dad," he whispered, so soft that only Victoria, who was closest, could hear him. "The roar wasn't from the Ferrari, it was yours." When he opened his eyes, there was a peace on his face that hadn't been there before, as if something that had been broken for 4 years had finally found a way to heal. Could a new beginning erase years of injustice? Was it possible that the roar of an engine could awaken not just a machine, but also the hearts of those who had forgotten how to beat for something greater than themselves? The racing track gleamed under the afternoon sun like a black asphalt ribbon bordered with emerald green. The air vibrated with the anticipation of hundreds of spectators, but also with something more tangible, the roar of perfectly tuned engines, each singing its own version of speed and beauty. In the pit, a 13-year-old adjusted the final details of a race car that wore colors no one had seen before on that track. Deep, nighttime blue mixed with brilliant silver, and on the sides, in elegant but visible letters, it read, "Davidson Project, Legacy and Truth." Leo had grown in those 2 years, not just in height, but in confidence. His hands, which had always been skillful with engines, now moved with the precision of a surgeon and the familiarity of a master craftsman. He wore a custom-made racing suit, but he had insisted on personalizing it with a small patch showing the number 27 and Gabriel Davidson's signature. "Are you ready, champ?" Victoria's voice came from behind him, loaded with pride and nervousness in equal parts. Leo turned and smiled. In these 2 years, Victoria had become much more than his engineering mentor. She had become the older sister he never had, the connection to his father's professional world that he had lost with Gabriel's death. "The engine is perfect," Leo responded, giving affectionate pats to the car's hood. "We use the configuration my dad designed for tracks with tight curves. It should give us an advantage in the technical sections." In the stands, Sarah Davidson occupied a seat in the VIP section, but not out of charity or condescension. She was there by right. In the past 2 years, she had completed a business administration program that Harrison had financed, and now she managed the administrative part of the Davidson project, a foundation that combined automotive technology development with scholarships for low-income youth interested in engineering. She wore an elegant but comfortable blue dress, and on her right hand shone a ring that had belonged to Gabriel, a simple ring with a small engraved wrench that he had worn during all his years as an engineer. Next to her, in a chair that had cost more than most people's annual salary, Harrison Sterling observed the pit with an intensity his former business associates wouldn't have recognized. The man who had humiliated a child for entertainment had almost completely disappeared. In his place was someone who had learned to find purpose in something greater than his own ego. His hair had more grey now, not from age, but from the stress of learning humility at 42. But his eyes had a light that hadn't been there before. The light of someone who had found a way to use his power to build instead of destroy. "Nervous?" Sarah asked him. Harrison laughed, and the sound was genuine, without traces of the artificial arrogance that had characterized his laughter for years. "Terrified," he admitted, "but it's a different fear. It's the fear that something that really matters won't go well." On the track, Leo was completing his warm-up lap. The car responded to his movements like a natural extension of his body. Each curve navigated with a precision he had inherited from his father and refined through 2 years of intense practice. But this wasn't just a race for him, it was a statement. During these 2 years, he had worked with Victoria and Harrison to create something completely new, a racing engine that was 30% more efficient than anything existing on the market, but which also carried a small but visible plaque with the words, "Based on original designs by Gabriel Davidson, 1978 to 2021. It wasn't just a tribute, it was justice. The race began with the roar of 12 engines that rose like a choir of metallic dragons. Leo occupied 5th position on the starting grid, not because his engine was inferior, but because he had insisted on earning his place on merit alone, without help from Harrison's money or connections. In the first turn, he passed 2 cars with movements that seemed choreographed by years of studying not just driving technique, but also the racing philosophy his father had transmitted to him. A race isn't won on the first lap, Leo. It's won by understanding the perfect rhythm between speed and patience. Gabriel's voice seemed so real that Leo turned his head for a moment, expecting to see his father in the passenger seat. But there was only air, and the roar of the engine that carried the soul of all the lessons Gabriel had given him. Lap after lap, Leo climbed positions, not with desperation or aggressiveness, but with almost supernatural precision. He seemed to know exactly when to pass, when to conserve fuel, when to risk, and when to wait. In the stands, Harrison had stood up without realizing it, his hands clenched in fists that trembled slightly. "Come on, Leo," he murmured, surprising himself with the intensity of his emotion. "Come on." Sarah had tears in her eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of pure pride, mixed with the feeling that Gabriel was somehow present, watching his son do exactly what he was born to do. On lap 15 of 20, Leo took 2nd place with a maneuver that made the entire audience stand up. He had waited until the exact moment when the leading car needed to reduce speed to take a tight curve, and had accelerated on the inside with a precision that seemed to defy the laws of physics. But he didn't settle for 2nd place. On lap 18, with only 2 laps remaining, Leo did something no one expected. Instead of risking a desperate pass, he slightly reduced his speed and began studying the leader with a predator's patience. Pure speed doesn't win races, Leo. Intelligence wins races. In the final curve of the penultimate lap, Leo saw his opportunity. The leader took the curve a little too tight, losing minimal but crucial speed on the final straight. Leo accelerated with a precision he had learned not from books or instructors, but from years of listening to engines breathe, of understanding exactly how much power he could extract without damaging the engine, of knowing the difference between speed and intelligent speed. The pass was beautiful in its simplicity. There was no drama, no contact, no heroic gestures. It was pure technique applied at the perfect moment. Leo crossed the finish line in first place with a lead of only 0.3 of a second, but it could have been 3 hours for how it felt. The crowd's roar mixed with his engine's roar, creating a symphony of triumph that seemed to echo to the clouds. But what moved Leo most wasn't the applause of strangers. It was seeing his mother standing in the stands with her hands over her heart and a smile that illuminated her face like the sun after years of rain. It was seeing Harrison jumping like a child, shouting with joy, without caring what other spectators thought of his behavior. It was seeing Victoria in the pit, wiping tears with the back of her hand while holding a stopwatch that had recorded not just the race time, but the exact moment when justice had found its way through time and metal. Leo stopped the car in the winner's zone and got out with calm movements. There was no uncontrolled euphoria, no dramatic gestures. There was the deep and silent satisfaction of someone who had just completed something that had begun long before he was born. He walked to the front of the car and placed his hand on the hood, exactly as he had done with Harrison's Ferrari 2 years before. "Thank you, Dad," he said, so soft that only he could hear it. "We did it." When he looked up, all the people who mattered were running toward him. His mother, Harrison, Victoria, and dozens of people who had followed his story during these 2 years. But before they arrived, Leo did something no one expected. He took from his pocket the same keychain he had shown that night in the hall, the number 27, and Gabriel Davidson's signature. He kissed it softly and raised it toward the sky, as if he were showing his father that the mission had been accomplished. The race's official photographer captured that moment, a 13-year-old holding a worn keychain while a race car with Davidson Project painted on the sides smoked softly behind him. That photograph would appear on the covers of 3 automotive magazines the following week, but more importantly, it would become the official symbol of the Gabriel Davidson Foundation, which in the following years would award scholarships to hundreds of young people interested in automotive engineering. When Sarah reached Leo, she wrapped him in a hug that seemed to contain all the love, all the pride, and all the hope she had been saving for years. "Your dad would be so proud," she whispered in his ear. "He is proud," Leo corrected, pulling back slightly to look into her eyes. "I can feel it." Harrison arrived next, and for a moment he didn't know what to say. The man who 2 years before had used his wealth to humiliate now found himself in front of a young man who had used talent and determination to honor his father's memory. "Leo," he said finally, "do you know what's the most incredible thing about all this?" "What?" "It's not that you won the race," responded Harrison, his voice loaded with an emotion he was still learning to process. "It's that you taught us all that winning isn't about crushing others. It's about elevating yourself and bringing others with you." Leo smiled, that smile he had inherited from Gabriel, and that seemed to have the power to illuminate any space. "My dad always said the most important speed isn't the one that takes you from one place to another," he said. "It's the speed with which you can make the world a little better." 3 years after that conversation, Leo Davidson would become the youngest driver to win a professional motorsport championship. 5 years later, he would be accepted into the country's most prestigious engineering program, with a full scholarship financed by the Gabriel Davidson Foundation. And 10 years later, he would establish his own engine design company, where the first principle on the main office wall would be a quote from his father: "Engines don't roar to impress. They roar because they're alive." But all that was still in the future. In this moment, on this track, under this sun that seemed to shine especially for him, Leo Davidson was simply a 13-year-old who had proven that dreams don't die with the people who dream them, that love is transmitted through knowledge, that justice sometimes arrives on wheels and fueled by gasoline, and that sometimes, just sometimes, the most powerful roar doesn't come from a machine, but from the heart of someone who refuses to let important things be forgotten. Leo looked once more at the car that had carried his father's name to victory, then looked at the people who had chosen to believe in him when no one else did, and finally looked toward the sky where he knew Gabriel Davidson was smiling. The roar of the engines had been silenced, but the echo of what really mattered would continue resonating forever. Because some victories aren't measured in seconds or money. They're measured in changed hearts, in preserved legacies, and in the speed with which love can travel through time. Luxury is bought, but legacy is honored. And the most beautiful roar always comes from the soul. If this story touched your heart, leave your like, subscribe, and tell us from which country you're watching us, because stories that heal the soul need to be shared to continue healing other hearts. What legacy do you want to leave in this world? Tell us in the comments.